transition from when I've got special to come preach. Thank me. Relentless Pursuit is our title this morning from Luke 18. Luke 18 is an interesting chapter. It begins right from the get-go. The author tells us the purpose of the parable, which I find interesting because usually Jesus explains the purpose of his parables and he does so afterwards. Not in this case. Luke 18 is a great opportunity for us to understand that the scriptures in their original forms are absolutely, positively God's word and everything that we need to know, but not everything that happened. That's why there's 4 Gospels. Some of them pick up things that the other ones missed. Some of them explain some of the same things from different perspectives. And at the same time, not always is every conversation recorded, but the ones wherein the teaching is there for us to learn something. Interestingly, chapter 18 of Luke has commentary at the beginning of it. It's the author Luke's commentary on the parable that Jesus told. If you look right before that passage, you see they're talking about something totally different. And as you go through, there's a lot of teaching being done here. But there's a break from where Jesus is talking. Chapter 17 ends up with Jesus giving some truths about another topic. And then there's a break, a natural break. This is one of the times when I don't have any disagreement with where somebody stuck chapters and verses. Because there's an absolute break here. And the author, Luke, narrates and pokes into the whole affair and says, and then Jesus told us a parable about why we should keep praying all the time. So apparently there was some conversation going on there that brought it up. Jesus didn't just out of the blue all of a sudden tell a parable with no explanation before or after. There was something leading up to it. He used parables always to teach in a situation or a format where he used it as a learning tool. So there must have been some conversation going on about prayer or faithfulness in prayer. He just talked about end times coming. And then there's this commentary by Luke that says, then he told us we were to pray all the time. And he told this parable. As in all of Jesus' parables, there's a circumstance into which he tells the parable that has a primary teaching. But as we saw with the parable of the lost son, it was not only a parable that taught about forgiveness and grace, but it also taught us a lot about the human nature of greed and self-will and all kinds of stuff. God's teachings to us lay down foundations that are broad in their teaching and they're also broad in their application. And so we see a parable today that talks about our faithfulness to prayer, to relentlessly pursue God in prayer. But as in all of God's teachings to us, the foundations apply to what he's called us to. And one of the things he's called us to, and one of the things that we've been making an emphasis on from the parables, is extending God's grace to others. Extending the love of Jesus to others. And if we are to be praying without ceasing, what was our one commission from Jesus? Was it to go into the world and pray? No, prayer is the work that supports the work. And in many cases, prayer is the work, or there would be no other work. Billy Graham's the first one to tell you that the main reason that his crusades were so powerful and so far-reaching is the prayer that went into them ahead of time. And the prayer that went on during them and the follow-up that came from them. We are not to grow weary. We are not to give up. We are not to quit praying. We're not to quit trying to reach people. We're not to quit trying to be Jesus' hands and feet. And we can sometimes get, shall we say, tired. We can sometimes get drained. Our cup can get dry. But Galatians 6:9 says we should not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. It was not that many months ago that I was having some serious talks with God about fruit. Are you done with me in ministry? What's the fruit of my ministry? When's the last time I led somebody to the Lord? It had been a while. One of the reasons I have been coaching you about not needing to see the fruit because that's in God's hands is because I've had to walk through that dark valley. And he had to remind me. Interestingly, after he reminded me, within a couple of weeks, we had 5 youth saved. And led a couple to the Lord since. But there was a long dry spell. And I start to think, okay, if I'm not seeing fruit, how can I expect anybody else to see fruit? And the reminder was, yours is not to see the results, yours is what? To be obedient. Be obedient to what I've called you to do. Galatians 6:9. Don't become weary in doing good. That doesn't say anything about us seeing anything. It says at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we don't give up. It doesn't say we'll see the harvest, does it? So Jesus teaches this parable. Luke tells us that the main thrust of the parable is about prayer. Interestingly, if you read the parable, there's nothing in the parable at all that says anything about prayer. It's an example of being steadfast. Only a few short weeks ago, we visited the fact that salvation is all about inequity. We don't deserve what we get. And we certainly don't get what we deserve because Jesus paid a price to make sure that we would not get what we deserved on the cross. The flip side of the coin is what we receive in salvation is justice because he paid the price. So salvation is something that we don't deserve, but that we receive it is just because payment was made on our behalf. This is a matter of God's love shown in his mercy so that we are saved and justice is served. The parable of the persistent widow is most often used to undergird this principle of persistence in prayer. But it's fully applicable to our commission to bring God's mercy and Jesus' justice to the world around us because of this key verse in Galatians that we've just looked at. And the battle for justice and mercy demands perseverance. The reason we're talking about justice and mercy is because in the parable, that's what the widow was wanting. It's justice and mercy. So let's look at this parable this morning. Look at it not from the light of what we know it to be, a solid teaching on perseverance in prayer, but also the application towards mercy and justice. That is the very statement of the parable itself. The judge, in the first place, the judge had contempt for God and others in the story that Jesus told. In verse 2, it says this. It says, he said, the judge, he said in a certain town, Jesus said, he said in a certain town, there was a